This week's Inside the Lords, a lot happening in Parliament, of course. Just to remind you, at the start of every day at the House of Lords, they have 4 questions to different ministers, each given 10 minutes. If you're asking a question, you get 30 to 40 seconds, so it's very tight, and then there's a 10-minute debate that follows. So it's very important, because it's packed, to try and get in on some of those questions if they're pertinent to your interests. And I often try and jump up and don't get taken. So this week I had a question myself, and that question was about the Darlington nurses who've been treated abysmally by their NHS trust, because somebody who also works with them suddenly appeared in their changing room. And remember, nurses have to get changed every day. So when he appears in their changing room, he's a man who identifies as a woman. No evidence of transition, no hormones, no medical intervention whatsoever. And they feel very uncomfortable. And there's nurses who work with them who, for, I don't know, religious reasons, or they just don't want a man changing in front of them. So they started to say this isn't acceptable. And the trust then said they need to go on a re-education course, that they didn't understand inclusivity, and really treated them as though they were the problem. And they've been forced in the end of this process to take legal action for their privacy, for their rights at work. So I was asking a question about it because Wes Streeting, the health secretary, has actually, last year, he posted a tweet saying that he was completely in support of them, that it was terrible what had happened to them, that he was shocked and horrified, and he arranged to meet them. So they've been waiting since then. They've met him, they got on very well, but then silence. And what they want is the government to produce guidance that means that they will have the right to get changed as a nurse every day when they get into their nursing gear, without having a male, however that male identifies, sharing their space. And by the way, this is not a one-off, because the same thing has happened in Fife, where the health trust there told the nurse that complained that she could get changed in a cupboard if she felt uncomfortable. So this is like ridiculous. So I asked my question, and the truth of the matter is I made a mess of my question, because when you're trying to speak for 30, 40 seconds, I didn't immediately get onto the question bit to the minister. I was trying to give a bit of context to people, and immediately around me there were baying members of the House of Lords, baronesses and lords, particularly from the Lib Dems, who are sitting quite close to where I now sit, who were all grouchy, saying, get to the point, get to the question. And obviously they were only saying that because of the nature of the topic. And that kind of threw me, I made a mess of it, I was in a really bad mood. And then the 10 minutes of questions that followed, the other people who spoke, almost all of them, with the exception of Baroness Hayter, a Labour peer, effectively said that the nurses needed to get used to accepting the fact that a very small group of people need to have their dignity and privacy respected too. So it was not a happy moment. I tell you that story because the House of Lords can be a place where you can really initiate a good debate, and it also be a place where things go badly wrong. And I was in a foul mood because I knew it was my fault that I hadn't got to the point. I then wanted to speak on the grooming gangs question that was coming up, but because I'd already spoken, I wasn't able to, and so I waited until there was a statement later on in the day. A statement, by the way, is when there's been a statement by a minister in the Commons, and they call it a repeat statement in the House of Lords, and that's given 40 minutes, 20 minutes for front bench contributions, and then 20 minutes for back benches. So I knew I stood a chance of getting in. I assumed it would be packed and there would be a lot of competition, because obviously this issue of the widespread rape of young white girls in northern towns and cities is a huge national scandal. And over in the Commons, they were actually involved in the debate about the amendment put forward by the Conservative Party. And so I thought everybody'd be there. Anyway, it was practically deserted. So I thought, right, well, I'll at least make my contribution. And I was listening very carefully to what the minister said, which was as usual, just like with the question I asked earlier on the gender critical point about the nurses. The minister, in relation to the inquiry question, was immediately, well, there's been an inquiry. It's all sort of like very calm, and they say the most important thing is we diffuse this issue and we use this much more inclusive tone and so on. But effectively avoiding all the points that were being made from the floor. So probably based on my rather grouchy atmosphere anyway, I stood up to make my contribution. As soon as I stood up and started speaking, the same old hecklers who were grouching and grumbling before, Lib Dems and Labour benches particularly, started going, oh, get on with it. And so it's interesting, this notion of tone, because what they mean is, be nice, don't use a hostile tone, but that means that you must retain, you must stick to the agenda that we put forward. You know, you must work within our parameters, and anyone who moves outside of that is going to be closed down or shown not a kind tone, but actually get some hostility. And so I rather lost my rag, because one of the things that was very important was that the government keeps saying there's already been an inquiry, but just to note that that inquiry is not specifically on the very real crisis of state organisations. In this instance, social workers, care homes, teachers, police officers, who seem to be implicated in not having acted when it became obvious that this was a gross attack on hundreds and hundreds of young women that was organised by men, largely of Pakistani origin, largely Muslim, and was slightly different than the kind of paedophile attacking young people. This was a different thing. It needs its own inquiry. Anyway, I lost my rag, and you can see the results below. What was happening over in the Commons was, of course, that there was the schools bill, which the Conservative Party tried to amend to get in the children's the inquiry into the rape gangs scandal. I just want to clarify one thing, which is that when the Labour government say this would have destroyed the bill, this amendment actually was derailing this bill, the schools bill, they have got a point. Parliamentary rules are peculiar, and so it probably was reasonable for people to say this wasn't the right vehicle in which to raise the inquiry, although because the government had not given anyone an opportunity to raise it any other way, I understood why it was happening. But keep your eye on that schools bill, because the schools bill itself is atrocious, and I'm going to be arguing against it in the Lords when it arrives at us, because it's effectively an anti-parental choice bill. And one of the most dangerous things about it is that it's an attack on homeschooling. Don't get me wrong, I haven't been homeschooled, got no particular interest in it, but it should be, and is indeed, a choice that's open to parents in this country. And this bill will effectively destroy it by bringing homeschooling into a very tightly regulated state control, both in terms of curriculum, what's taught, inspections, and so on and so forth. And the basis for doing that is that parents can't be trusted to teach their own children, to look after their own children. In fact, they say parents teaching at home is a safeguarding risk to children, which is just so ironic when you can consider that the majority of young women who were raped and sexually abused in the rape gang scandal, were actually in state care homes. So the idea that the state is going to say to parents, you are untrustworthy and a safeguarding threat, is just a nonsense. Finally, just in terms of like not hitting the point, I had already mentioned the problems in relation to the rape gang scandal in a second reading of a bill in relation to terrorism. I just mentioned it in passing there. The government has brought forward a bill, and this is not an anti-Labour point, because to be honest with you, this was a bill that was hanging over from the Conservatives when they were in government, which is the Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill, which basically argues that what we urgently need to do in order to protect the public from the threat of terrorism is to bring in a national regulator that will effectively have the powers to fine massively all sorts of venues, anyone that can host up to over 200 people to 800, and then 800 up, there's a different level of censure and punishment. They're going to have to go along with a whole range of one-size-fits-all rules and regulations. It's going to be very damaging to the public square, in my opinion. You can see what I argued below. Obviously, this is very important to us at the Academy of Ideas because we put on live events. So all the different venues we use, from the largest one for the Battle of Ideas to local salons and seminars and so on, are going to be affected by this overbearing, overzealous regulation. But that's not really the issue that I was raising. It implies, because it's all inspired by what happened at the Manchester Arena bill and the Manchester Arena bombing, in which 22 people were killed by an Islamist terrorist. The implication is that the problem there was the Manchester Arena, and that something about the way the venue was organised, that might have been a small part of it. But it would be wrong to suggest that that was the main problem. And if you remember, on the night of the Arena, we do know that a security guard who was worried that the young man, the 22-year-old who was hanging around outside with an overlarge rucksack, looking fidgety, praying, looking suspicious, he wanted to go up and speak to him, but he was frightened to, because he was frightened, the security guard, that he'd be accused of racism and Islamophobia. And therefore I used the example of how many people who worked for state authorities also didn't intervene when they knew that young women were being sexually abused and tortured, and in some instances killed, because they didn't want anyone to think that they were particularly targeting local Muslims in case somebody might think that they were Islamophobic. And so they are much bigger questions. Yet lots of parliamentary time is now going to go into this bill on protecting buildings rather than dealing with the much deeper problems. And just my final reflection is, this bill has been known as Martin's Law. Martin's Law because it's in honour of Martin Hett, who was a young 28 or 29-year-old who was blown up on the evening. I mean, what a total tragedy. And I understand his mother, Feigen, really genuinely thinks that this is a contribution in honour of Martin. And that's perfectly reasonable. I understand she wants there to be a legacy of more safety at venues because her son was so brutally murdered in this way. But the difficulty is that we as politicians are not meant to pass legislation based on an emotional appeal by a parent or a relative of someone who's been killed. And yet the government kept saying we should have consensus, this bill should go through smoothly, think of Martin, think of his mother, we need to make sure that we don't argue over this, let's make this happen as quickly as possible. It's like an emotional blackmail to stop you scrutinising the bill. And all the time we were told, remember the victims. And all I can say is, we've had a week when parliamentarians have not remembered all the victims. Apparently, only some victims count. And so I will carry on trying to raise some of these difficult issues in the House of Lords. See all my speeches below, including, by the way, one on Israel, where I also lost my temper when the only people who were blamed for people suffering in Gaza was Israel. No mention of Hamas, no mention of the hostages, and every opportunity I get, I raise that double standards and contradiction.